In the Middle Ages, there were many strange traditions and rituals that could shock people from the 21st century. You were definitely not told about it in history classes at school. In this video, you will learn about the most insane and bizarre medieval traditions. Divorce in the Middle Ages was truly bloody. Many think that divorce is a practice that appeared relatively recently, in the last couple of centuries. However, it was possible to get a divorce even in the Middle Ages, but the process looked completely different back then. For example, in medieval Germany, there was a practice of trial by combat between spouses. Thus, a husband and wife could settle disputed issues, including divorce if only one side initiated it. Such duels took into account the differences in physical strength between a man and a woman, and therefore, there was an interesting rule. The husband was placed waist deep in a pit dug in the ground with one hand tied behind his back, and in the other, he held something like a sword or a sharpened stick. The woman was armed with several stones wrapped in fabric. This weapon weighed several kilograms. The man could not leave his pit, but the woman could freely run around and strike. It all ended quite harshly. If the loser did not die during the duel, he was executed. The well-known words from the wedding vow "till death do us part" gained a new meaning in the Middle Ages. Animal trials. Imagine a scene where a real court hearing is taking place, but instead of a person, a pig is the defendant. In the Middle Ages, this was a common practice. Animals could be tried and sentenced to death. There are many historical documents that testify to this. For example, in 1457, there was a high-profile trial in the town of Savigny, France. A pig and 5 piglets stood before the court, accused of attacking and killing a child. The trial was conducted according to all the rules. In addition to the judge, there were prosecutors, several witnesses, and a defense team present. At the end of the hearing, the judge found the pig guilty and acquitted the piglets. The pig was sentenced to death. Such cases may seem strange, but in medieval Europe, trials of animals were a widespread phenomenon. Pigs, cows, goats, horses, and dogs that allegedly broke the law were usually subjected to the same judicial proceedings as humans. But the most cruel violators, judging by the number of surviving documents, were pigs. They behaved quite savagely and often attacked people. However, the law could be harsh not only towards animals but also towards those who showed cruelty towards them. For example, medieval testimonies about death sentences for people who were cruel to animals have been preserved. Women in the Middle Ages shaved their eyebrows and plucked their eyelashes. Today, women spend a lot of time taking care of their eyebrows, trying to emphasize and make them brighter. For example, in the first half of the 15th century, women had a completely different idea of beauty. At that time, they wanted to have a high forehead and an oval face with a small nose and lips. The maximum similarity with a child's clean face was considered the ideal of beauty, so all vegetation was removed from the face as much as possible. Not only eyebrows and eyelashes were plucked, but also part of the hair on the front of the head was removed to push back the hairline as far as possible. The eyes remained the only bright color accent on the face. Moreover, a sad and emotionless face was considered beautiful. By the way, many believe that it was because of this fashion that Leonardo da Vinci did not paint eyebrows on his famous portrait of Mona Lisa. However, this is not true. First of all, the artist began painting the portrait in the early 16th century, when this fashion had already passed. Secondly, according to experts, Mona Lisa's eyebrows were drawn but were erased during one of the early restorations. Medieval shoes with very long toes and other strange fashion trends. You may have noticed this shoe design in movies about the Middle Ages, but in reality, this trend for long toes in the Middle Ages was even more crazy and funny. Such footwear, called poulaines, was especially popular in Europe in the 15th century. The toes of the poulaines varied in length, and generally, the more noble a person was, the longer their toe was. Many people tried to make their toe as long as possible to demonstrate their status. Only nobles could afford to walk in such uncomfortable shoes, since working in poulaines with long toes was simply impossible. To ensure that the long toe stayed in shape and did not drag on the ground, they were filled with some soft material like wool. The poulaines themselves were mostly made of leather. Archaeologists have found many poulaines during excavations, mainly because fashion did not change as quickly back then as it does today. A particular style could be at the peak of fashion for centuries, if not more. So, one could wear the same shoes almost all their life and still be the most stylish. This is not the only strange fashion trend in medieval clothing. Another example was the so-called codpiece, a flap that men fastened below the waist. The codpiece could be seen in both knightly armor and everyday life. In armor, this attribute had more practical value for protecting important organs. However, in everyday costume, the codpiece played an aesthetic role. In this way, men tried to emphasize their masculinity. Since many men wore tight leggings in those days, the codpiece was very noticeable, although it was primarily worn for this purpose. Some wore it under clothing, while others fastened it to their belt on the outside. The fashion for the codpiece was widespread in the 15th and 16th centuries. For example, in many portraits of the famous King of England, Henry VIII, you can easily see this attribute. In medieval England, football was forbidden. England is considered the birthplace of football and one of the world leaders in this sport. However, during the Middle Ages, football was outlawed in the country. This was because 700 years ago, the game was much more violent, chaotic, and dangerous than it is today. Some players could die during a match, and the game simply had no clear rules. An infinite number of players could participate in a match, and players were allowed to do practically anything to obtain the ball. As a result, in the early 14th century, the English king decided to ban football, including due to excessive brutality. Those who violated the king's order were sent to prison. Just imagine how much of a mess football looked back then if even medieval people considered it cruel. The first wedding night with witnesses and other strange wedding traditions. It's hardly a surprise to anyone that medieval marriages, especially among the upper classes, were rarely based on love. Rather, they were for political and social gain, and women at that time, of course, had no voice. In fact, both men and women were considered ready for marriage at the age of 13 or 14, which seems quite strange by today's standards. The actual wedding ceremony in the Middle Ages was quite different. To begin with, couples did not need permission from a special government agency to enter into marriage. They could do so literally in no time, simply by expressing their consent. Therefore, marriages were concluded anywhere on the street, in a pub, or at home. Therefore, it is quite difficult to say today which couples from the Middle Ages were actually married. But perhaps the most interesting fact about medieval marriages is the tradition of the first wedding night. Among the upper classes, this was not at all a private event. In addition to the newlyweds, witnesses were present in the room during the first wedding night to make sure that the conception process took place. Some degree of privacy could be ensured by curtains on the bed. However, this element of the interior was not present in all cases. April Fool's Day or the Day of Fools was celebrated already in the Middle Ages. However, in those times, the holiday took place not on the first day of April, but at the beginning of January. This tradition migrated from paganism into Christian Europe. The essence of the medieval Fool's Holiday was as follows: representatives of the nobility switched places with the lowest layers of the population. Servants for one day played the role of masters, and the nobility, on the contrary, became servants. During the celebration, everyone dressed up in various costumes, sang indecent songs, and drank to excess. Being a jester in the Middle Ages was far from being as fun as it may seem. The attitude towards them is vividly demonstrated by the fact that the famous jester hats were made in the likeness of donkey ears. However, there were also advantages to such an attitude, since everything that came out of their mouths was perceived exclusively as a joke and was not taken seriously. Thus, jesters got away with a lot, including very bold and quite offensive statements towards the nobility, or even some political statements. Don't forget to give a like if you found this video interesting, and also subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to always stay up to date with new videos. And of course, leave your comment under this video.